Okay, why do I think that provide for a good link between the brain and the mind? So let me go back to my example of a given presynaptic neuron, a given postsynaptic neuron, and I'm going to again be very simple here, so please bear in mind that this is just an illustration example. I don't really believe that we have a neuron that represents for the metro bus stop, okay, but nonetheless to communicate with you I'm going to use that. And likewise, I'm going to create a neuron that represents for the church near the NSF building. Okay. In reality, those mental states and those concepts are represented by spatio-temporal patterns, as I argued at the beginning, so collections of neurons co-activated in time. Now, in this case, I don't yet know that the metro bus stops near the church. Okay. And in fact, there is no synapse there. Okay. However, I'm saying that if I am to see one day that the metro bus stops near the church, I would form a synapse there. And the question is, in order to do that, I need both these two neurons to be active in the right pattern, let's say active at the same time, and I need this axon to be near this dendrite. So the question is, why is the axon of the metro bus stops near the dendrite of the church by the NSF building? The question is, why are those axons and dendrites in proximity? Why do they happen to be there? So this axon here, the metro bus stops, is not there by chance. Axons are not, they don't wander around the brain by chance. It's way too expensive. They're there because they have business to do, and in particular, they have to make contacts with other dendrites. That's what axons do for a living. So they were not making a contact with the church, but they're making contact with something else, for example, with the Ballston metro station. And if you work at NSF, you might know that the metro bus stops at the Ballston metro station because you've seen that many times. So that contact is present, that's knowledge you have already. Now, where is your dendrite here? Where your dendrite is there because you know this church already. It's not this church is a new concept. You know there because when you drive to NSF every day, you drive by that church. So that contact, that piece of information is already in your brain. Okay? What do I mean? And I go back to the comment I think you made earlier. What do I mean when I say you know that already? I know that already, you know that already. What I mean is that you can activate that mental content, give it the right cue. Meaning that if you're in a different place at Thanksgiving, eating turkey, at our cousin's house at the lake, and we say, hey, do you know the church near NSF? You kind of wonder, stare in the vacuum and say, yeah, I know that. Right? So you're activating that mental state, which means the synapse is there. Okay? Aunt Shirley, who is not working in SF and is coming from Colorado, doesn't know what we're talking about. Does not know that church. She knows other churches, but not that one. Okay? Now, because this dendrite is located in this place because it's making synapses there, and this axon is located in this place because it's making synapses there, it happens that this axon is overlapping with this dendrite, and therefore, if those two events occur in time and we saw the metro bus stopping by the church, we can make that synapse, and we learn it. So why do I say that's context? Well, because there are topographic maps in the brain, and neurons that represent close enough semantic content happen to be near enough the brain. Why? Because they want to minimize the wiring in the brain, because 150 billion miles of cable is enough, and we don't want to waste more cable out of that. Our heads are already big. And so proximity in semantic space corresponds to proximity in anatomical state, and the fact that the axons and dendrites that make sense to make synapses because they encode for the right context corresponds to the fact that they are nearby, and therefore synapses can be formed. So this is pretty much what I'm summarizing here if you're reading that. Yeah.
So if you have the axons and the dendrites, and they're intertwined, yeah, but they don't always have synapses between them.
Right. In fact, we measure those at the microscope. Only about 1 in 10 synapses are present, are expressed among the locations where the axons and dendrites come in close enough proximity to potentially form a synapse.
So the development of the growth or the development of a new synapse is what kind of process? A chemical, electrical, chemical?
Both of those, yes. It's an electrochemical process.
So are you saying in a sense, does this mean that the pattern of the dendrites and axons and neurons in the brain is some sort of a projection of the map of the map of the surface? I mean, you're sort of making a one-to-one for some kind of correspondence between locations in space and locations.
Let me make that explicit, if I understand your comment. I believe that you can think of physical connectivity, in other words, the map of all the synapses that are actually expressed between axons and dendrites, the contacts between the axons and dendrites that are there, and those make for a map of what we know, okay, at some level. Yeah. Like I said, the details of that, there is a lot to understand, and I don't pretend to know it. But somehow the map of what we know is encoded in the actual synapses, those 10 to the 15 synapses in our brain. Now you can also make a map of all the locations where the axons and dendrites are near enough. Those are going to be maybe 10 times as many as the actual synapses. That somehow encodes, it represents a map of what we can learn given the right experience.
Right.
So
What we can learn instantaneously. Now, if I take a course, I would have branches that form. I would even do more.
But this would imply that if something is not, if they're not in physical proximity in the brain, we can't learn a connection.
That's correct. That's your visitor from out of town that sees the metro bus, sees the church, and doesn't learn a thing.
How would the metro bus being connected, being physically close to the church physically, then how would it be able to make connections with other concepts,
right,
something that don't have any relation to
right,
physical proximity in real space?
Well, okay, so this is my point. Those two neurons are nearby, and this guy is here because this branch grew in the course of months. This is something that took you a whole year of driving to an SF every day to learn. Okay, so that's why you actually have a branch there. But once you have a branch there, this axon at this point is, this dendrite is actually located there. So it not only do you learn something, but you create the potential to learn a lot more because you have the background knowledge now.
So this happens in the hippocampus. Something, you go like that, so what's that mean?
Yeah, for sure in the hippocampus, very likely in the neocortex at large, but not everywhere in the brain. There are parts of the brain that lose their plasticity after development, and it's probably good that they do. For example, you don't want the area of the brain that controls your heartbeat or your respiration to be too plastic, right? You don't want to forget how to do it and so forth.
So do you all know the trigger that sets off the electrical chemical reaction that develops a new synapse?
The chemical trigger, you're saying?
Glial cells?
Yeah, most likely there is glial cell interventions. There are also growth factors that are involved. There are lots of neuromodulators that are involved. The biochemistry of it is very, very complicated. So what I'm describing here are general principles. And at this point, there are many labs that are entirely dedicated to try to understand the details of how specifically those things happen. Yeah.
This business with the synapses. Okay, maybe some people have a healthier setup of working of their synapses, therefore they can grasp more material, and so you've got your astrophysicist as opposed to maybe your clerk. Is that a leap? Is there something to that?
Might know differently.
Possibly, yeah. I mean, I would say maybe a safer bet is to think of the fact that on average, a 14-year-old can form and eliminate synapses a lot faster than a 94-year-old. And that is known with more, I would say, certainty than the difference perhaps between an astrophysicist and the clerk, for which we don't quite know. You know, people have looked at Einstein's brain and they found some peculiarities, but not as much as they had hoped for. So I think that the specifics of the inter-individual differences might occur at the biochemical level, at the anatomical level, physiological level. I mean, I can, you know, if I have to place a bet, I would tell you how much money or how little money I would spend, you know, on the bet. But certainly this is very much age dependent. And also it is neuromodulatory state dependent. So what you can learn when you're, say, rested in the morning or after a good meal and so forth might be different than what you can learn when you're tired or distracted and so forth. So those are all regulator of your ability to create and eliminate synapses. Yeah.
What your examples are seem to be sort of like fact statements, individual fact statements, and then you're connecting to facts. What about a more abstract thing, like constructing the idea of a mental system in general, like the orange line? What happens when you do that based on a series of experiences?
Yeah, I don't know. They're hard. So I would say, like I said, maybe Tononi's theory is what it gets closest to that, where he's using an entropy-based formulas to create a geometry, a whole geometry of the mind. I think that you had your hand up very patiently for a while.
Thank you. Based on what you're saying, at least what I hear, is that the brain has, as you put it, a map of information, of connection, which is, it's a map of information that the brain can make. So when it receives a new experience, it has to relate that experience to the map it already has to determine what synapse should be connected, you know, where there should be a synapse if there should be one. Is that correct?
Yeah, I would say so. And in fact, I would push it even one little step further, which is to say that it's a dynamical process where the map is necessary to instantiate the mental state, but the instantiation of the mental state changes the map in one sweep.
So the map is always changing. It's always
Continuously, correct. As soon as you form a synapse, you're also changing the potential to form nearby synapses by the same token, essentially.
So that changes the evaluation of future data.
Correct.
Which also tends to create an individual's reality.
Absolutely.
And that's the connection to the neocortex.
Yeah, those things are probably happening all in the, what Tononi calls the thalamocortical system. So it's, yeah.
If your aunt from Colorado who doesn't know anything about this area moves to, say, Bethesda and has to commute to here, and she learns that, is the brain creating new axons?
I think it's my next slide. So I'm going to have that example. However, somebody said, how about weights, right? So when we learn neural networks, we thought that changing synaptic weights correspond to knowledge. Well, in this framework, that's not so. Okay, so like I said, I'm going to take a hard stance here. According to this theory that I'm presenting, relative change in synaptic weights do not correspond to the acquisition of new knowledge, and I'm putting a note here because, like I said, I know I'm taking some heat in stating that. I'm not saying that changes in weights do not correspond to anything. I think they're extremely important. Changes in synaptic weights, so how strong the synapse is an extremely important aspect of our physiology. And it is plastic. It does change. What that change is not the ability to instantiate is a mental state, but the probability. So it's not the capacity to think of something, but the likelihood that you will think of that thing. Okay? So for example, let me give you an example. Both my wife and I, and my wife actually spoke at this very chapter a while back, know what a p-value is. However, she's a mathematician and I'm a neuroscientist. So she uses p-values 100 times more often than I do, let's say. Okay, for her statistical analysis. So we both know that. We both have that synapse in place, assuming that those are just two neurons, which is not, of course. Okay? But her synaptic weight is much bigger than mine. Okay? So we both know that fact. It's just that she thinks of it a lot more often. And so given the same cue, which might be a light cue, she might think of it and I don't. Now, if you come and explicitly tell me, hey, Giorgio, do you know what a p-value is? Let me think about it. Yes. Okay, yes, I know it. Whereas she might tell you in her sleep. all right, without you even asking. Okay, so I think that synaptic weights are very important aspects of our mental lives, but they do not correspond in my mind with what we know and what we don't know. What we know and what we don't know correspond to the actual presence of the synapse, not to the weight of the synapse.
So it's kind of like how important.
Correct, exactly. So one is the presence of the knowledge and the other one is the retrieval of the knowledge. Yes?
Going back to the mapping and the context analogies, I imagine you already thought of this, but pragmatist philosophy and John Dewey emphasized that all learning has to be in a context, and that's why he developed progressive education and tried to get rid of rote learning. Of course, even rote learning is in a context, it's just less efficient. And that also creates a path dependency of learning, but nevertheless, the argument was that all learning is in a context, all scientific knowledge is in a context, and all evaluation is based on context also. So what you're saying is a physiological and post-chaos theory or post-fractals theory, analogously the same thinking, though, as went into pragmatist and Dewey's.
Like I said, I don't think I'm saying anything that is new. I think that, my hope is that at the end, you would all walk away thinking you knew this already. That's actually it's the best dream of a teacher, The typical scenario, however, is that, you walk out and say it was all wrong, So this is something that at this point, because there were many interesting questions, many of the things I can now go quickly on because we said already. The first one is that the ratio between the actual number of expressed synapses and axonal dendritic overlaps is not fixed. It changes both in times and space in the brain, and one is not predictive of the other. It's not as simple. It's always a fixed ratio. And that means that the potential to retrieve information, which is the actual synapses, and the capability to acquire new information, which is the potential to form new synapses, are independent cognitive functions. Okay? We can know a lot about an argument, about a topic, or we can know very little about a given topic, but we could have a lot of potential to learn about it. Okay? So ideally, when you're done with Calculus 1 and you're about to enroll in Calculus 2, you know very little about Calculus 2, but you have at that point, hopefully, a lot of potential to learn it if you ace Calculus 1. Okay, so let me actually try to go through the temporal and spatial scales of the brain that really should, even if I'm not going to go through the technical aspects here, should give you a sense of the distinctions among the various aspects of both physical and mental lives that we're talking about. So I have two columns here, the brain and the mind. And so the first principle says that the activity patterns of the brain correspond to mental states. So these are cell assemblies, what neuroscientists and philosophers of mind call the binding, and psychologists call subjective experience. And if you're an experimentalist, you would measure this with electrodes and voltage detectors. And the temporal scale for these occurrences is from a fraction of a second, let's say a third of a second, to about perhaps 20 seconds for a given mental state, a memory or an intention or something like that. Now, here is a weight. So that's a synaptic weight. What happens when you change the synaptic weight? So this is what in the brain neuroscientists call long-term potentiation or long-term depression or spike time-dependent plasticity. And these are all very, very key aspects of what we study in physiology these days. In my mind, that's not necessarily learning if you define learning as the capacity to instantiate a new mental state that you did not have before. So actually learning new knowledge. No, I think that that's more like adapting opinion. If I have some examples, but if you perhaps move from Bethesda to Northern Virginia like I did a few years ago, I knew Northern Virginia already, but now I am much more confident driving in Fairfax. And now when I go back to Bethesda, I was like, hey, where was Georgetown Road again? Was that in the next right or the following right? And actually I know that, I still know that, but it's not my automated response as it used to be. So this we still measure with electrodes and voltage detector, and the time scale it's about the same. So synaptic weights change almost instantaneously. Now here is really the crux of what I've been talking about today, synaptic formation and pruning and this dance that I described of synaptic boutons in the axons and spines in the dendrites. And this is really knowledge acquisition. I like to think of that as real learning, something that you did not know before and now you know. This occurs very fast in the course of our experience, something that can be from a few seconds to a few minutes, and the kind of technique experimentally would use to see that the formation of new synapses is electron microscopy. So this allows you to actually detect the physical scale of the synapse formation. Now, I also express the idea that the close proximity between an axonal branch and a dendritic branch corresponds in the mind to the immediate ability to learn, given that you are exposed to the right experience. So if you are experiencing the right event, then you can form the synapse if your axons and dendrites are close enough. And how are your axons and dendrites close enough? Well, they move too, except they don't move in a few seconds. They move in a few minutes or hours or days, okay? And now this also you can see from electron microscopy, but now there are so-called high-resolution light microscopy levels that allow you to do that on much wider fields. And in fact, it's very recently that people have now mapped an entire fly brain at this level, an entire 16,000 neurons that were just published earlier this week from a group in Taiwan. So I think that we're getting close to having complete maps for very complex nervous systems at this scale. Now, if you look at more broadly and more coarsely, axon and dendritic overlap, so not necessarily close proximities between an axon and dendrite, but hey, is this axon from this oak tree coming somehow in nearby the dendrite from this other cedar tree? This is kind of classic light microscopy, so a few microns. And this is perhaps the learning ability given an extended training. You know, if you're taking a course in college and you're there for a few months, this is the kind of thing, you know, from the day to the year scale. You have plasticity there. You are able to change that in your brain, but it's not something that is one experience changes it all. And finally, of course, we have lifetime learning. We have neurogenesis. During development, new neurons form. In fact, in the hippocampus, new neurons form through the adulthood and until death. Neurons also migrate. They sprout. New branches come out all the time. And of course, this is development of new capacity, you know, the right stuff. You truly learn a new language or something like that. And that's something that goes on into the lifespan and also is at the spatial scale of light microscopy. Okay, so these are, in a way, all types of plasticity, all types of change in the brain that corresponds to phenomena in the mind, but at very different scales, both in space and time. So I'm going to give you an example that should wrap it all up in terms of, and this is, I think somebody said, how about the aunt from Colorado? What was she saying? Okay, so I'm still going to use my NSF example since we're in this building. So let's say that you know the route from Interstate 66 to NSF, and that means that synapses are present among the appropriate neurons. Okay, so if you know how to get from 66 to NSF, it means that you have those synapses. And let's say that occasionally, or if somebody were to ask you, you can spontaneously think of the directions. And for example, if it's Wednesday and you say, oh, cool, on Saturday I'm going to the skeptic seminar, I'm really looking forward to that, you can think, you can kind of mentally rehearse those directions in a spontaneous way. Now, you might spontaneously think of those directions in a very occasional way, maybe once a month, when you think of that interesting skeptic seminar. So let's say now that for a twist of fate, you are offered a job as an NSF scientific staff member and you happen to take it. So now I betcha you're going to start thinking about those directions between Interstate 66 and NSF a lot more often. So you already knew how to get there, but now you think about it every day because you're a commuter. And so that will change the synaptic weights. Okay, those synapses were already in there, but now those synapses are active a lot more often. Now, let me go the other direction, which is suppose that you know Arlington well because you've been you lived in the DC area for 10 years, but you had never been in an SF. And your friend says, hey, come to the skeptic seminars at NSF. I was like, oh, really? Where is that? And I tell you the directions. You did not know where NSF was, but because you know Arlington well and you've known the DC area for 10 years, I tell you directions, you learn them. You form that synapse that was not in there before. So you did not know before where NSF was, and now you learn it. Now again, your friend from out of town who did not know Arlington well would not learn it, given the same explanation. However, that same friend of yours visiting from out of town, later on, let's say, becomes a rotator at NSF and moves in and starts visiting NSF daily, and after a few months will know their way in and out of the building much better than you and me. Okay, so they actually grew new branches that created new context and so forth. But it took months, not one-time experience. Okay, this is my very closing slide, and I'll get to my drive, okay? So here is something that I actually care a lot. I was trained as a chemist, and I've taught and learned the hard sciences, and I continue to do that, and I work mostly with microscopes and computers and electrodes day in and day out. And I believe in the physical world, okay? So don't take me wrong here. However, there is a paradigm that we go by that is only one way to look at reality. And I want to try a pitch here that although this is very useful, it's not complete enough. And I think that this is only one aspect of what we have to think of as scientists. And we have to learn to think in other ways as well. So the classic paradigm is that there is a physical world, and somehow brains evolved through that. And somehow the key tenet there is that there is some emergence, some mind that emerges from the brain there. Nobody can really explain exactly how or why, but that somehow the subjective experience allows for observations. Those observations, by the way, have very strong consequences on the empirical world because allow us to create science and technology. So by observations, we can create laws of mechanics, and we can then create machines and do lots of very interesting things. And of course, there is a logical possibility that the brain would do that, but somehow that logical possibility that the nerves in the brains would create that we know happens, somehow it's unclear how that goes through the subjective experience. Why always it happens that we have some internal states that correspond to those aha moments. It never goes that way. And also that introspection that it corresponds to so much of our drive, okay, of our internal lives, from the scientific point of view in modern science, those are mostly incredibly treated as epiphenomena. And to me that's very disturbing because I don't want to play anymore if that's the case. I feel like it's, that's the fun here. What do you mean it's an epiphenomenon? What do you mean we could do without? Science, modern science, could pretty much stand as is in a world of zombies. And that to me is somehow not satisfactory. So here is an alternative, not better, but just alternative way of thinking, which is we start from observations. That's, as scientists, the foundation of everything. We observe, okay? Now, the key thing is that observations are subjective states. Observations are personal, inner states. When I observe an apple that falls from the tree, that's my mental state. It's mine. I'm very possessive. Now, the observations can be observations about the world or expression about the mind, and everything else is inference. Based on those observations, we say the world exists. Note that the world exists was up top here, right? But no, I'm saying that's an inference of the fact that we experience the world. And now, very much if I infer the world exists, I have to infer that my mind exists as well, because I have plenty of observations about my mind as well. Now, the materialist logic says that the world exists and somehow the mind emerges from that. Idealists say that the world is just a creation of the mind. I don't care. They're both inferences in this framework. Now, the fact that the world exists through intuition, axioms, logic, communication, lots of beautiful things that have occurred in society for centuries have created science and technology, and those have changed the experience and the observations in our lives. And somehow the fact that the mind exists as an inference have not quite created as developed a science and technology. I think that psychology in a way started and moved in those directions, but then somehow subjective, there was some confusion about what was subjective or what objective, and there was a whole behaviorist movement, and a lot of things stopped there. And I think that it's time to take the observation of subjective states as an integral part of science. And the fact that they are subjective does not make them not amenable to scientific observation, because even our observations about the world, the material world, are subjective to start with. But then we have inference and we have communication, and we can check on our sanity, because we can tell our ideas to our colleagues, we can experiment, we can see if the observation is still there tomorrow and the day after tomorrow, and see if our fellow scientists in the next lab can reproduce our data. Okay, so those things can be done not just on the experience of the world, but on the experience of the mind as well. And I'm going to stop there. Like I said, this is, of course, a large framework, and that relationship between brain and mind is a very, very complicated field. What I talked about today and the capacity to acquire new knowledge through the overlap between axons and dendrite is just one very, very simple and specific aspect of it that I happen to be obsessed with, because I've liked learning and memory for many years, and I've liked to stare at dendrites and axons under the microscope because they're really, really beautiful. So that's where I'm spending my life on. But I think that there is a lot more that can be discovered on that very relationship between how the brain works and how the mind works. Yeah. Please. Yeah.
You've given us a physical model that helps us understand the difference between, say, forgetting and losing capacity. And could you apply that, for example, to language capacity? One of the things that we're finding out very specifically is the loss of capacity to learn new languages during certain windows of life. So that by the time a person is 12 or 13, they really can never acquire native ability in a new language. So can you relate that to the physical model?
Yeah, I think that this is one of the reasons why I think that this has great potential to explain a whole host of phenomena, and one is exactly that of the critical windows. And language, again, is very complicated because we cannot pretend that it's individual neurons that correspond to, say, words and stuff like that. However, it is a very striking example and a very human example. So here is how I would cast it in this physical model. During development, during critical window, let's say when a kid is 5-year-old, for example, their axons and dendrite grow at tremendous speed. Their neurons are growing throughout the cortex. They are, in fact, in some regions still migrating. And that is a process that lasts from before birth to about age 7, approximately. Then there are other aspects of axonal growth that continue on until early adolescence, and others.
I think that there's some windows that close before 5.
Yes, indeed. So indeed, the temporal windows of plasticity are actually brain location dependent. So the prefrontal cortex is probably the last part of the brain that finishes development. At this point, we know that in humans that continues to develop until late 20s. Okay, so saying that a 25-year-old is in some aspect not an adult is neurobiologically a correct statement. Again, if you look at the capacities that are specifically in the type of judgment and wisdom that is encoded in the prefrontal cortex. Now, what does that mean? That means that during those critical windows, you have tremendous growth of axons, especially axons. Dendrites grow as well, but like I said, the majority of the space is covered, is bridged by axons. So the movement of axons is much more consequential from this point of view. And so you have the ability to create very massive contexts, new contexts, in relatively little time. Okay, so if you're exposed to a language, you grow thousands of axons within days, and you create not just the knowledge for those 500 words that you learned that week, but also the capacity to acquire much, much more.
Let me give you an example. Some of the scientists that are funded in this building are discovering that a child is, say, 6 to 12 months, 6 to 18 months, exposed to half an hour of Mandarin Chinese in 12 sessions has some of the brain configuration of a child in Taiwan.
Yeah. And those areas of the cortex, which are most likely Broca's areas and Wernicke's area, which are the areas for both the understanding and the production of language, are likely to be plastic. Exactly. Those are likely to be most plastic in those time periods of development. So there is a start and an end to those windows of opportunities for given cognitive capacities.
And in this country, we teach a foreign language in high school.
Yeah, that's changing, though. I mean, I think that that's one of the things that we are understanding now. So hopefully we're learning from that. Yes?
I was a cognitive psychology professor for 30 years at Iowa State and the University of Georgia. And I found after retiring, I found that there are very well-developed methods for doing this dotted arrow over here, being used by meditators. Now, you will know that there's a lot of research neuroscientists and meditators related to each other. And that's, I think, the missing thing there, right? So I don't know if you know anything about that, or if you would care to talk about it.
Yeah, there is some movement there, and in fact, I think 2 years ago at the very large Society for Neuroscience meeting that is attended by 30,000 plus people, the Dalai Lama came and gave a beautiful talk on meditation, and there is now a lot of brain imaging that is done on meditation and meditative states, and it's very clear that there is a correspondence to physical states. However, the technology that we have right now to image the human brain during a given mental state is such that we have very coarse resolution in space of the order of millimeters, which would correspond really to perhaps hundreds of thousands of neurons and bundles of fibers. And time, because we're at the time window of maybe a second or maybe a tenth of a second, whereas a spike lasts a millisecond. Now, if we stick an electrode in let's say, a rat brain, or if we put some voltage detector in a fly brain and we look at it under a microscope, we can look at individual neurons and individual spikes, but we can't quite tell if they're meditating. So somehow we need to bridge those technologies, and if we were able to start seeing at every one individual neuron in real time, which means milliseconds in the brain, I think that we could truly do a humongous map between mental states and brain states. And somehow, of course, when you think about the numbers that I was putting up on one of the early slides, 10 to the 15, and now you have the temporal dimensions, you have 10 to the 15 every millisecond, right? So you need really, really large computers to do that. But we can do that. I mean, yeah.
Would you say to someone, okay, the way to find out what's going on in the brain is to meditate, or to do this sort of thing that you're doing?
Both. So let me ask you something. No, this is perfect. No, absolutely. I think that this is very clear in my mind. Would you say that something being cold, is that really because it feels cold when you touch it, or is it because the particles in that object are moving slower? Well, both of those things are true. And in fact, we learned as scientists that the fact that the particles in that iron bar move slower actually somehow corresponds to a measurable thing, the temperature, that also corresponds to the fact when you touch it with your finger has a given perception. And that same iron bar, if you heat it up, somehow when we measure it with the right techniques, the particles are moving faster, and then when we put our finger on it, ouch, different perception. Okay, so that correspondence, does it have a logic to it? Well, we get, we habituate, we now accept it. It makes sense that the slow particles somehow feel that way and the fast particles feel that way. And I think in the end, that correspondence between the fact that these given activations of of spatio-temporal patterns of neuronal activations feel that way as mental states will be something like that. We'll get, when we understand that map, we understand that, hey, look at that. When we are sad, it's because the patterns of neurons are active in this way. And this actually corresponds to the fact that, look at that, when the particles of this iron bar move slower, the iron bar is colder. There is going to be a correspondence, and both of those things are real and true.
But they're subject to change. I mean, moderation, for instance, perception. You can convince someone that touching them with a cold bar is really touching them with a lit cigarette in terms of the way the brain perceives that same signal.
Absolutely, and very much of a lot of this is actually very much context dependent. Yeah. And like I said, there is a lot that we do not know or understand about how the spatio-temporal patterns of neural activations correspond to mental states. Right. And so again, among the theories that are out there that dive a little bit more in the specific than I dare to do myself in terms of how those do, Tononi's theory that speaks very much in terms of entropy and information encoding actually postulates something that would possibly explain what you just said, which is the amount of cognitive content corresponds not only to what is encoded in a given pattern, but what could be potentially encoded by any other pattern that could be instantiated at the same time. So by encoding a pattern, you're not only expressing an information, but you're also excluding all the other information that you could express at that time. So that's the idea of entropy, right? So it's one possibility out of all the other. And that means that when you learn something, because you form a synapse, even if you're not activating that synapse, you're not thinking of that something in this very moment, you have the potential to, and therefore you're changing your consciousness of something else. Because when you think of that something else, you're excluding this mental state that before you were not excluding because you did not have the capacity of that.
You're less plastic.
You are, well, you have less potential, you have a different potential to instantiate something. So, but again, these are theories, and in the end they will be testable, but certainly we don't have the technology to test those at neither the spatial nor the time scale in anything close to a human right now.
But on a model basis, you have the primacy, for instance, vision. What you see will override a lot of the factual information. The wine testers that were given white wine but colored with red described it all in red wine, and these were experts,
right?
Because they, I think that goes along with what you're saying.
There is a lot of evidence both ways, because as psychologists teach us, I would say there is also a lot of evidence that goes in the directions where sensory information acts as a modulator of what we expect, and truly a lot of what we perceive is based on what we expect rather than what we're actually seeing. So that's where a lot of the context dependence comes.
I was just wondering if when you learn something, when that what is it, the synapse changes, that you could be learning something general as opposed to something particular. I gather memory, to some extent, is what they call it a script, and
yeah,
something you can use generally.
The devil's in the detail, and I'm not done with this framework. I think that this framework has potential to explain many things, but I think you're putting your finger on something that is very critical there, which is when you physically what you do is you create and eliminate synapses. But like I said, concepts do not correspond to neurons. Concepts truly correspond, mental states truly correspond to spatio-temporal patterns of activities. So individual synapses change in very, very complex and difficult to explain ways. The potential for instantiating spatio-temporal patterns. And I somehow suspect that the distinction between general memories and very specific memories have something to do with how generally or specifically individual synapses participate in routes. Sometimes you have hubs, airport hubs where lots of flights go through, and somehow you have others that are very, very specific, and if you have to go there, you land there. If not, there is no reason you would. And something like that might occur at the level of brain networks.
If I recall correctly, you were saying that the acquisition of new element of knowledge is with the formation of a synapse occurs pretty much instantaneously in response to experience. Sometimes minutes.
Yes, seconds to minutes. Yeah.
Seconds to minutes. I remember hearing about some work, probably on NPR or something like that, where there's a lot of apparently post-processing during the night of information that was acquired during the day, and that actually a lot of it gets filtered out. And,
yeah.
There's some kind of noise that's added in, and only the stuff that's above the noise level.
Yeah. 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 There is a whole issue of consolidation, and in particular. So I mentioned two structures very often during this talk, the hippocampus and the neocortex. And a lot of what I've described is a mechanism that might be shared between those two, but the roles that those two structures have in the learning, in the acquisition and storage of new information is quite distinct. The hippocampus learns and forgets quite fast. The neocortex learns and forgets a little slower. So one of the very famous theories of how we learn things and consolidate it is that when we are exposed to an immediate experience, we quote learning in the hippocampus. And then we store it in the long term back in the cortex. And those processes of consolidation almost certainly involve the sleep-wake cycle. Okay, probably both REM and non-REM sleep, but non-REM sleep for sure.
And there are differences in whether you learn propositional or kinesthetic skills in different parts of the sleep.
Yeah, specifically in particular, the role of the hippocampus is very peculiar for explicit memory, so for propositional statements that you can almost express by language if you like, but certainly in a very conscious, explicit way. But the idea, the biophysical evidence is that in general, when we learn something, we actually form and we create perhaps many more synapses than we need, and then we sieve them through. We kind of eliminate the excess ones. So it's possible that, given the urgency of, okay, we have an experience, a lot of stuff gets formed, and then only the connections that are actually useful to encode for that specific information are retained as we consolidate during successive sleep-wake cycles.
In your title, but not elsewhere in your talk.
Yeah, I didn't have the self in my title, but no, not in the original title I had sent to my host, and somehow I was asked to change the title, which I was happy to. Yeah, I think that my original title had learning mental states and neural nets, something like that. But I'm always happy to talk about the self. And actually, like I said, I think that in the end, when I think of mental states, I actually think about what we can relate to ourselves. And a lot of what the hippocampus does in the formation of synapses has to do with the ability to think of yourself in the past or in the future. Those are the so-called autobiographic memories. So, like I said, this is something that I'm always happy to elaborate on, perhaps over coffee and cookies.
I think that's what we should do now.